Okay, so Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In this occasion, my group that consists of Syifa, Azizah, Yani, and also me, Ismi, Reza, Karomah. Today we are going to explain the material that is about language change in EFL context. Next slide, please. So, in this material, we are going to talk about the verse about language change itself, the second about the variation change, the third is how does change spread, the fourth is how do we study language change, and the last is reason for language change. Okay, without wasting any time, let's jump into the material, the first material that is about language change. So, language change is often treated as an entity independent of its speakers and writers. In reality, it is not so much that language itself change as the speaker and writer change the way they use the language. Speaker innovation is more accurate description than language change. Speaker innovate sometimes spontaneously, but more often by imitating speaker from other communities. If their innovation are adopted by others and diffused through their local community and beyond into other community, then linguistic change is the result. Next we are going to talk about variation change. Okay, so there are some points that I will talk in this phase. The verse about language varies. It has three major ways which are interestingly interrelated over time in physical space and also socially. Language change, variation over time, it has its origin in spatial or regional and social variation. The source of change over time is always current variation. And then within a monolingual community, the superficial impression may be that everyone speaks the same. In a small town, it is often seems that everyone uses the same language, but a little thought will soon identify areas of variation, most obviously in vocabulary and also pronunciation. All language change had its origin in variation. The possibility of linguistic change exists as soon as a new form develops and begin to be used alongside an existing form. If the new form spreads, the change is in progress. If it eventually displaces the old form, the change has become a fait accompli. One area of vocabulary where this is very easy to see is the slang word used by the young people to mean really good. And the next, we are going to talk about post-vocalic R, its spreads and its status. So in many parts of England and Wales, Standard English has lost the pronunciation of R following vowels in words like star and start. Post-vocalic R doesn't occur in RP nor in the London Cockney dialect. The loss of post-vocalic R seems to have begun in the 17th century in the southeast of England, and it is still in progress since there are areas such as southwest of England where R is still regularly pronounced. Accents with post-vocalic R are called rhotic. In large area of England, rhotic English accents are regarded as a rural and uneducated. In large part of the USA, on the other hand, post-vocalic R is alive and well and extensively used. Many US accents are rhotic under the influence of Southern British norm. However, Eastern New England is generally non-rhotic, but there is also conflicting pattern. A survey in 1960s found that racism was increasing in New York, where it was regarded as prestigious. The pronunciation of R in English-speaking communities provide a wealth of example of the complexity of linguistic variation and language change, as well as the arbitrariness of the form which happen to be standard in any community. While our last speech is the prestigious from which is still spreading in England, in some part of the USA is the rhotic variety which is increasing. It is appears that post-vocalic R appear first time in the speech of upper middle class New Yorkers and then gradually filtered down through different social classes until it reached the speech of the lowest social class in community. And then we are going to talk about the spread of vernacular forms. So in 16, so in 1960s, linguistic survey by Labov suggested that these attitudes were indicated by the way local pronounce the A and OW sounds in word like light and house. Their pronunciation of vowel in this word has gradually become more and more centralized. For example, light, they will pronounce it as laid, and house, they will pronounce it as heus. The position of the tongue at the start of the vowel had moved toward the center of the mouth. So light was pronounced light. It sounds more a bit like late, and house were pronounced house, a bit more like house. The sound change, which seems to be unconscious, was a change to a more conservative pronunciation, which used to be associated with the area in the past. It had been dying out, but it was revitalized to express solidarity between those who identify with the island and feel loyalty to its rural values and peaceful lifestyle. And the centralization of the vowel in the line was particularly significant for signaling Islander identity. So the speech of relevant social groups may have prestige based on a particular social identity, such as a gang membership or valued occupation in the community. It may be considered cool or anti-establishment or innovative rather than conservative and validity. The relevance of both linguistic and social factor in accounting for languages change is particularly apparent when we consider the result of contact between the varieties. And the next is about coyness and coynization. So before that, we need to know what is coyness and coynization. So coynization is language change process when people who speak different dialect come into contact in monolingual communities and result coined, a variety which is the result of dialect constant. The linguistic process involves different types of simplification. The first is labeling, that is a process which eliminates mark variance. Labeling result in the coin adopting fewer forms than the range of form in the search of dialect. And the second is simplification of different wither or categories, where two groups of speakers from different dialect are come together. The simpler form will usually win out. So when dialect speaker who makes the distinction between he was swimming and they were swimming meet dialect speaker who don't make this distinction, example they say both he swimming and they were swimming, then the process of simplification suggests that the simpler form will survive. Using only was is simpler than changing from was to were with different pronouns, and this has been result in many areas where English is spoken. Just the way form is used with all pronouns in many English dialects. More recently, sociolinguistics have identified a new type of coin, an immigrant coin, which from the mixing of linguistic weather among multi-ethnic groups in big city. The speech of young migrant or the children of migrant provide the crucible for the varieties that have been labeled as multi-etholics. Yes, multi-etholics. In these varieties, the majority language might serve initially as a lingua franca, but the new multi-ethnolike soon develop very distinctive feature as a result of many different languages and dialect, which different speaker bring to its construction. That is about coinage and also coinization. For the next material, about how to change spirit, it will be explained by my partner Shiva. For Shiva, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ismi. Now we're going to the next phase, which is how to change spread. So change can spread from this, I'm sorry, this next slide, this three aspect. First is group to group, next style to style, and word to word. And let's talk about group to group first. So many linguists have used the metaphor of waves to explain how linguistic changes spread through a community. And any particular change typically spreads simultaneously in different directions, though not necessarily at the same rate in all directions. Social factors such as age, status, gender, and region affect the rates of change and the direction in which the waves roll most swiftly. The wave metaphor is one useful way of visualizing the spread of a change from one group to another demonstrates. In any speech community, different sets of waves intersect. You belong simultaneously to a particular age group, region, and social group. And a change may spread along any of these dimensions and into another group. Next is from style to style. So this theory suggests the change spread from one style to another, while at the same time, it spreads from one individual to another within a social group and subsequently from one group to another. So using this model, we express the spread of prestigious post-vocalic air pronunciation work, for instance, first in the most formal style of young people in the most socialist group in the community. Then it will spread to a less formal style for that group, while also spreading to the more formal style of other groups, such as to older people's speech and the speech of people from a lower social group. And the change gradually spreads from style to style and from group to group till eventually almost everyone uses the new form in all their speech styles. Next, the last one is from word to word or lexical division. So it seems to be the case that sounds changes not only spread from one to another, from one style to another. Lexical division is the sound changes spread through different words one by one. So when the sound changes begin, all the words with a particular vowel don't change at once in the speech of a community. In English, like true and tough got left behind with final F, compared to dove, dove, and bow, which lost their final fricative consonants as a result of a widespread sound change. In New Zealand, a vowel that is currently in progress is the merging of the vowels in word pairs like beer and bear, which used to be distinct. And this change too seems to be proceeding by the process of lexical division. A recent study suggested that the distinction had disappeared completely for most young people in pair really or rarely, while fear and fair were still distinct in many young people's speech. Okay, next, let's move on to the next page, which How do we study language change? So a study increase or steady decline in the frequency of a poem by age group suggests to a sociolinguist that a change may be in progress in the speech community, whereas a bell-shaped pattern is more typical of a stable variation. Comparing the speech of people from different age groups can be a useful clue then to language change. And this has been called the apparent time method of studying change. The differences between the speech of older people and younger people are interpreted as indication of changes in progress. Younger speakers tend to use more of the newer or innovation forms, and the older speakers use more of the older conservation forms, the ones they adopted in their teenage years. And when the change involves the spread of a prestige from or an admirer's usage, then it is easy to see the evidence of its spread. An increase in the use of these forms in speech of younger people is a clue that a new form is being introduced. Next phase or the last phase is reasons for language change. And there are several reasons for language change, including social status and language change, gender and language change, and interaction and language change. But first, let's talk about social status and language change. So social status and language change, members of the group with the most social status, for example, plan to introduce changes into a speech community from neighboring communities that have greater advantage in their eyes. While lower class speakers are more influential in spreading less conscious linguistic change. And lower class men, in particular, often adopt speech from nearby local workers to express solidarity rather than status or prestige. And interestingly, it is not the people at the bottom of the social heap who tend to innovate in this way, but rather those in the middle of the pile. While the upper working class is how this group has sometimes been described. Next, let's talk about gender and language change. So differences in women's and men's speech are another source of variations which can result in linguistic change. And sometimes women are the innovators, leading a linguistic change, and also sometimes men. And women tend to be associated with changes towards both prestige and vernacular norms, whereas men often introduce vernacular changes. Okay, next, the last reason is interaction and language change. So frequent interaction as well as positive attitudes to preserving homogeneity were crucial factors that prevented the development. One of the best known example of linguistic conservation is Iceland. So Iceland has altered relatively little since the 13th century, and it has developed very little dialectal variation. And by contrast, during the same period, English has changed radically and has been characterized by gross dialectal variation. And TV may have played a part in explaining at least the speed with which pronunciations like vulva have spread. And with the constant switching between at least two languages in an interaction, the languages have become more and more alike. And it is the communicative needs of the people, their need to be able to interact easily, which has led to a merging of the grammar. On the other hand, each group also wants to be identifiably distinct, and this has led to the maintenance of differences at the vocabulary level. And one pair of linguists commented that This is the linguistic equivalent of having your cake and eating it too. And that's all from me. Thank you. I give it back to Reza.
Okay, so that's all that we can explain about the language change. We hope that our presentation is good enough. And the last, we say wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thanks in advance.